and welcome everybody. Although I can't see you, you're very, very welcome. Pranjali has explained more or less what I'm going to talk about. I might just clarify just a few things. So look, we're dealing with the burn, as you can see here on the slide. I presume everybody can see that. And being members of the Burren Bio, I'm sure you know exactly what the burn is all about. So I'll just move on to the next slide here. Oh, it's actually not moving. Hang on a sec now, sorry. Oh yeah. So look, tonight's plan, and hopefully this sounds okay to you, everybody. I thought probably what I deal with first of all is how and why the Burren is so diverse in its flora and how different plants prevail here from different parts of the world, how they can live side by side. We'll just touch on Ireland's flora as a whole, how many species we've got, etc., and maybe just put the Burren into context with that, because it's quite interesting to see how important the Burren is in terms of flora. We look at examples of unusual combinations of plants, and if you've been on my walks with the Burren Bio, we've touched on this. We'll have a look at a few of those. And then I thought we'll go through the seasons. I think Pranjali mentioned it to me before that might have a look at some plants through the seasons. They're not necessarily, some of them are iconic Burren plants and some of them are just kind of plants that are found everywhere, but they're just kind of important and significant. So we'll have a look at some plants through the seasons, just maybe 3 examples of each. And then we'll finish with some resources and for plant identification if anybody's interested. So I'm not quite sure how long this is going to take, but if I'm going on too long, we can cut it short. And if it's too short and we need to expand on things, if there's anything that particularly interests you, we can have a look at that too. So hopefully that sounds good to you all. So look, firstly, I suppose we look at how and why is the Burren so diverse? Where did the flora come? Why is it there? Why does it prevail there in the first place? And I suppose there's 6 main influences on the Burren flora and on the Irish flora per se as well, but we're particularly focusing on the Burren. So the first thing is it's mild and moist climate, and that's because, I don't know if you can see my pointer, you probably can, of the Gulf Stream that we're familiar with, I'm sure, that comes up from, Central America up towards Ireland here. It gives us a very moist and mild Atlantic climate. So frosts are not very frequent in the Burren. They do exist, obviously, but it's less frequent really than other places. And we're in a coastal area with an Atlantic current, so it's very mild. And there isn't that much difference between the extreme high and extreme low temperatures. So that makes it a very sort of a place where plants that normally come from warmer climates can survive here. Now I have the reason, the influence here in black here and in red writing is how it influences the plants, I suppose. And apologies if anybody is colorblind. You'll know by just the italics, the bold italics there is the plants, how it affects the plants, I suppose. So that's the moist mild climate first. The location then, we're an island off the continent of Europe. And although we're very far north, relatively speaking, because of that, the Atlantic drift, we have a very mild climate as well. So it makes it very wet too, because we're so oceanic. So we've got a really wet climate, and that can also affect plants in the Burren, in that because it's such high rainfall, it means that there can be pockets of acidity and stuff in the Burren, which you wouldn't really expect being on calcareous limestone. So we'll come across that as we go through it. Our glacial history is really important as well, because I suppose the last ice age was the last glacial maximum. That's when the ice sheet was at its biggest, was 22,000 years ago, roughly. We weren't really fully glaciated. There is theories about where we are, where we're not, but I suppose the popular theory is that here's Ireland and England under here somewhere, and you can see that the ice sheet covers most of Ireland and England, but there was some areas that land actually protruded through, which was tundra conditions, like what we have in northern Russia now and places like that. So you have very sort of cold, denuded soils, permafrost, and actually an ice sheet. So with this tundra, you've got plants that would normally grow in Arctic and tundra conditions were growing around the Irish area and the Burren too. And as the ice sheet melted, some of those tundra and Arctic plants remained there, and we'll explain why that is in the Burren, particularly a little bit later on. But these are relics from the glacial time, so they're there over 22,000 years ago. So it's quite incredible to think they still survive, even though there's no ice sheet anymore. So that's really important, the glacial history. Post-glacial colonisation, that is basically is when the ice sheets melted, which was about 10,000 years ago. Then, our vegetation, our flora and fauna started colonizing Ireland. And I suppose this is where there's a lot of debate and a lot of controversy, because we don't really know how plants and animals came over to Ireland. And I suppose very briefly, the previous sort of theory or the theory that stood for a long time was that there was a land bridge somewhere coming from England across to Ireland. And England then in turn was attached to Europe. And that animals and plants must have moved from Europe, across from England, cross a land bridge somewhere into Ireland. And this is just this is just one example of a land bridge. There are other theories that it went from Wales across, etc. But this is kind of since the Celtic, Celtic explorer in recent decades now have been mapping out the Irish seabeds. They've really sort of dissed this land bridge theory, because the Irish Sea is a bit too deep for that, and it was unlikely that there was ever a land bridge here. So I just was reading an article there recently. Since 2021, Queen's University Belfast are having a look at this and having a look at alternative ideas. And just to be very quick, they reckon there's two things that may have happened, but there's no proof for it as yet. But it may be that as the ice melted, it was so heavy on the landscape that as the ice melted, the land then rose just where the ice sheet was melting, enough out of the sea to allow plants and animals across. That's called the post-glacial bulge is what that's called. And this is quite interesting because we'll see as we go on, when we look at specific plants, it's been discovered really that the flora in the Burren and in Ireland and other places as well is closer in genetic makeup and in sort of physical form to the Mediterranean and Spanish cousins, if you like, rather than England. So there's a lot of evidence to say that a lot of our vegetation that's from the Mediterranean areas and the Iberian Peninsula came from Spain and down there rather than across from Ireland. So that question is sort of hanging up in the air, and how did that happen? The bulge may explain that, but nobody really knows as yet. The other theory is that there's a boggy, mushy connection between Northern Ireland and Scotland, because there's a little bit, it's more shallow there. But look, we'll have to see, because vegetation has a very specific colonizing pattern across Ireland over the thousands of years. So it's not likely to be random, shall we say. So this might answer why species from Spain and Mediterranean are found in the West Coast, in Kerry, in the Burren, some parts of Donegal, and yet they don't exist in England, for example. And this has been a mystery for years. So anyway, regardless of how it happened, I suppose colonization, we start off with smaller pioneer plants in Ireland after the ice melted. The land would have been very denuded of vegetation and soil. But over thousands of years, forests started developing and mixed vegetation. And the Burren at that time would have been, when climax vegetation was reached, it would have been dominated by hazel woodlands at the time. So landscape is very important as well. And we, as you all know, we have a dominant karst landscape with very thin calcareous soils. So this means that Mediterranean plants and plants from Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, can survive because it's pretty warm and it's dry and it's thin, dry soils. But it also means that completely the opposite pole, the Arctic species that were the relics from the Ice Age, can still survive here alongside the Mediterranean plants that need the heat, warm and dry. The Arctic species, they can tolerate heat, but what they also need is a lot of radiated light from the rocks, which would have been from the sun originally, or from the snow originally, but the rocks in the Burren act like radiating bright light, like the snow would have done. And also the vegetation is very low, so they can survive very well. They need really low vegetation, because if high vegetation is grown, they just get outcompeted. So the other thing is that plants can tolerate high alkaline conditions grow here as well because of the limestone. The other thing is that the whole limestone plateau of the Burren is pretty flat. It's only 300 meters is its highest. Slieve Elva, which is kind of more slate and shale, is 345 meters, but that's relatively low. So the sea influence, the strong Atlantic storms in the wintertime can have far-reaching effects in that it blows inland a long way the salt. So you can find salt-tolerant plants quite far inland and up on the top of the mountains, where normally you'd see them at the coast. So that's another very unusual thing. But it's not so unusual around the coasts of Scotland or other parts of Ireland as well. It's just where there's a lot of exposure, I suppose. So there's also a diversity of habitats, because we've got limestone karst, turlochs, fens, hazel woodland, calcareous grasslands, and we've also got 16 protected habitats under EU legislation. They're called the Annex 1 habitats. So we got a lot of rare plants as a result of that. So human history also has a big influence on our landscape. Hunter-gatherers were there. It was in 2016. It was thought that they were humans came to Ireland around 6,000 years ago, but it was found in 2016, a bare bone, which the photograph is here on the right-hand side, had butcher marks on it. You can see the scratches there. That was found in a cave near Ennis, and it dated people. The earliest evidence of humans in Clare is 12,500 years ago. And you may have heard the latest evidence, a bone from a reindeer here, a femur from a reindeer has butcher cuts in it, and it's been dated at 33,000 years ago. So this has thrown our whole human history in Ireland as a whole off the rails, because we thought that humans, well, up until very recently, that they were only here for 12,500 years ago. But either way, these people wouldn't have had much influence on the landscape because they were hunter-gatherers and the population was very low. But when the Neolithic farmers sort of developed in 6,000 years ago, they started cutting the forests, they started making field boundaries. They were our first farmers. There was an expansion of semi-natural grasslands for the first time. We don't have natural grasslands in Ireland because our climax vegetation is woodland mainly. So it's called semi-natural grasslands because they're natural in that there is native grass species, but they're only semi-natural because without human intervention and traditional farming practices, we wouldn't have any grasslands at all. Well, we would have some, but we would have very, very few because most of our land would be covered in woodland. So they had a huge impact on our landscape. So hopefully that just gives you a sort of an overview of the influences that are so important in the Burren. Ireland's flora, just a very quick touch on this. How many species do we have? Well, we have 812 native flowering plants. We have 3 native conifers, and we have 78 native ferns. And we have just over 1,000 kind of naturalized alien plants, seed plants in Ireland. Now, without getting into too much detail, you can have a scan of this table here, but Ireland is very, very species poor compared to other countries per kilometre squared. That's a natural thing. It's not a bad thing. It's because we're an island and we're quite isolated, and it's taken time for because we got, for colonization would have taken longer, etc. And we have different influences, I suppose, than other countries. So just to put Ireland into context, we have about 0.003% of the global named plant species, and only less than 1% of all European species. So you can see how species poor we are. And again, that's not because we've lost species, that's just a natural thing. But if we put the Burren into context with our less than 1% of our European species, the Burren actually has 75% of all Irish flora recorded there. So that's quite incredible if you think of the Burren alone, and the national flora, 75% of it is recorded in the Burren. That's why it's such an important place in terms of plants. And just to note that there's 23 of Ireland's 27 native orchid species, for example. It's been long recognised as a botanical mecca, as I'm sure you're well aware. It was first mentioned for its gentians and ampines in 1650s, which is a long, long time ago. And in the 1850s, it was kind of well established abroad as a botanical excursion location, even back then. So why is it still diverse, biodiverse compared to the rest of Ireland? Because we've lost a lot of our biodiversity, not just in Ireland, but globally, I suppose, but Ireland particularly too. And I think it's the biodiversity has prevailed here in the Burren because it's not agriculturally intense, or it hasn't lent itself to become agriculturally intense because it's got thin soils. They're generally rocky soils. So reseeding and ploughing wasn't really an option for a long, long time in the Burren. Although the lowland grasslands now, I see a lot of them being ploughed up and reseeded. The practice of winterage, keeping the cattle up in the hills in the winter time, has been essential for keeping the uplands kind of clear of hazel scrub, because hazel is the climax vegetation and it can come back very, very quickly if those winterages are abandoned. And we can see that already in the Burren in places where cattle aren't put up in the winter anymore. So the traditional methods of farming have kept the Burren so biodiverse. So we have a lot to be thankful for past farmers and present farmers that are doing their best in different schemes and whatever to keep the Burren as biodiverse as possible. So, farming practices are changing, and even in the Burren, so diversity has been lost. So, it would be a shame to see further loss, and hopefully, programs that pay farmers properly to uphold these practices is kind of essential for its survival, really. So let's have a look at a couple of unusual combinations of plants. Now, I've chosen a few combinations, and then we're going to have a look at, as I say, examples through the seasons. I haven't necessarily chosen the iconic species of the Burren, because I don't know how botanically experienced you are, but I just thought, some plants that aren't so iconic or so rare, you'll come across them more, and maybe you'll be able to recognize them if you're not familiar with them already, rather than trying to look for rare ones, which can be quite hard to identify sometimes, and you can never be quite sure sometimes that you have a rare one unless it's very, very distinctive. So hopefully there'll be plants here that you'll know and you learn more about, or if there's plants here that are quite common in the Burren that you'll get to know the next time you're out for a walk somewhere. But just to give you this one is the sea plantain. I don't know whether you know, it's pretty small. You see it growing in little rocky crevices. It's a coastal species, and you can see here the maps here. It's very much around the coast, but around Mayo, Galway, etc., it's far more inland. It's a coastal species in England, but it's very much inland because of the exposure of Scotland as well. So it is a plant that you'll find on the top of the mountains in the Burren, but really it's a coastal plant and it's very tolerant of salt. So keep an eye out on the coast when you're there. You'll see where it should be growing. And if you're ever hill walking or along the tracks, you'll probably come across this plant. And it's because the wind and driving rain bring in the salt, as you know, in the wintertime particularly. The other thing here is, you know, I mentioned Mediterranean species and Spanish species, Iberian species, I suppose, growing alongside Arctic alpine species. And just to give you an example, the bloody cranesbill here is very common in the Burren. And you'll see the distribution maps here, the BSBI distribution maps of each species to give you some idea of how common they are or not to the Burren and elsewhere. But it survives here because of the mild winters. The rocks are warm, the heat is radiated from the rocks, the thin, dry soils. Whereas you could find them growing alongside Dryas octopetala here, the mountain avon. The two of these could be grown alongside, even though they come from opposite ends of the globe, I suppose. And these are relics of colder times, high level of reflected light off the rocks, and low level of vegetation, so they can compete with the local vegetation. And another anomaly is acid-loving plants like ling heather, which you normally find in a bog, is growing alongside calcium-loving plants. And an example here is a carline thistle here, which is, and it's if you're familiar with, it's quite small, but it's really very unusual compared to other thistles. It's very distinctive, but it loves calcium, and you won't find it where there's any kind of neutral soils. It really needs alkaline soils, and yet you could find these two growing beside each other. And the reason for that is because of the rainfall is so high because of our Atlantic climate. The soils can leach, and because of a high rainfall, the rain can sort of settle in pockets. The vegetation doesn't really break down fully, and you get a little thin layer of peat on top of the limestone that acidifies it, allows the ling heather to grow beside the likes of these calcium loving plants. So that's really kind of unusual thing in the Burren as well. Let's have a look at some plants through the seasons. We'll take spring first, and we'll go through spring, autumn, summer, or spring, summer, autumn, should I say. So let's just have a look. I've just chosen three. Now, I couldn't really give a sort of a spiel about plants in the Burren without mentioning the gentian, the spring gentian. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. So it's an Arctic species, and it's also an alpine species as well. I met a French woman at the beginning of this year. Actually, it was over at Pound-na-Brone. Got really excited about seeing them for the first time this year. And there was a French tourist there, and I just mentioned it to her, and she goes, "Boof, yeah, so," because she's so used to them all over the place. We were so excited, but sure, she sees them everywhere in France, where she came from the Alps. So she wasn't, yeah, she said, yeah, fine. But it's just funny that, you know, it's so unusual for us, and it's a species specific to the Burren. It's something that you mightn't know about it is, I just give an interesting fact. And when I say fact in inverted commas, some of them are real facts and some of them are just kind of stories. But just to give you an interesting fact about the gentian, it produces hundreds of seeds. But because it's evolved in the Alps and Arctic conditions, it has evolved that the seeds need to be frozen before they'll germinate. And in the Burren, we don't always get hard frosts enough to allow them germinate. So a lot of the seeds don't germinate. So the question was, how does the gentian then reproduce itself? And most of the gentians you'll see them in a pot, like if you go out to Fanor in the spring, they're everywhere. There's carpets of them. And that's because they send out little stolons and they grow from those stolons. So each individual plant is vegetatively produced. It doesn't produce by seed. So they're clones of each other. So don't know if you're aware of that, but if you notice that they're all in clusters usually. So they've adapted to reproduce primarily by stolons in Ireland, which is unusual. You won't find that in the Alps. Another one is bitter vetch. Now, this isn't really very rare per se, but it is a plant that is very much reducing dramatically across the country. It's a grassland species, a calcareous grassland species. The good thing is in the Burren, it's still pretty common, but I've noticed a huge decline across the country. There's a lot of pea family plants. I'm sure you know the vetches, etc. This one you recognize because it doesn't have tendrils on its leaves, and it's got sort of large singular flowers on it. The interesting fact about this one is that its root tubers were used in medieval times in Scotland as appetite suppressant, and there is evidence that it was also used during the famine in Ireland to try to stave off hunger for people at the time. So that's the bitter vetch, another spring flower. And of course, we'll always include an orchid in our seasons. And our first orchid is the early purple orchid, which is readily recognizable because it's the first one out in the spring. And also, if you want to be sure that it's it, if you bend down and give it a good sniff, it smells like tomcat pea. Some of them smell stronger than others. Some of them don't really have a very strong tomcat pea, and some of them really do. But give it a smell and see if it smells like tomcat pea, and that would be sort of diagnostic for you to know that it's the early purple orchid. And you can see the shape of the flowers there. I might come back to that if I have time, if you want, just ID features, but mightn't have time. So why am I including this one? Because as you can see, it's very common all over Britain and Ireland. It's very scattered. When you see, yes, it's in nearly every part of the country, but in the Burren, it's in profusion, and everywhere else you might just find one or two isolated ones in different places. So this is your first orchid. Now, just it is believed that there's a bit of a tradition that it's believed that the black spots, which are very distinctive on the leaves here, it was believed that, or the story goes, that this orchid was growing under Jesus's cross when he was being crucified, and his drops of blood dropped onto the leaves, and the plant has kept these marks ever since. So you can believe it or believe it not. Okay, so let's have a look at 3 species from the summertime. This one you may or may not have come across. It's the hoary rock rose. This one can be overlooked quite a bit because it looks very showy in the photos here, but actually those flowers, one of the interesting things about these flowers is that it is a Mediterranean species. So it needs a lot of sunshine, and we don't always get the sunshine in the Burren that often. So when it's a really, really sunny day, and if it's flowering, it will have its flowers wide open. But if it's a dry day even, and it's overcast, those flowers will stay more or less closed. So you could walk past it not noticing it. And I suppose if that's the case, you notice by its kind of little fleshy leaves here. But you'll find that around Blackhead, Powell's Sola, around that area. It's scattered around there. It is near threatened species worldwide, so it's a very important species, and so it's pretty rare. The interesting thing about this is that this is one of the plants that was studied in great detail back in the 1980s. They looked at petal size, leaf size, stem width, etc., etc. And it was found that it has unique characteristics only known in Ireland, which would suggest that it has evolved into an endemic Irish subspecies of this plant, compared to where it's found in other countries. It was also compared with the British population and the Spanish population, and it's got much more similarities with the Spanish population than the British population, which would support the theory that plants came directly from Spain after the Ice Age. So that's one of those plants that contribute to that theory. So thymus, so the wild thyme, I'm sure most of you will probably be familiar with this. It is mostly coastal in Ireland, and why it is mostly coastal in Ireland and not in England, I couldn't really find out that answer to that question, but very common. It's very small. You probably have stood on it or picked it up and crushed it in your fingers and smelt the lovely thyme smell off it. That flowers in May and July. What you mightn't know about it is that it has two parasites that like extracting nutrients from it. So you may or may not be familiar with the thyme broom rape or a banshee alba, which is a parasite. Here's a photograph of it on the left here. What it does is it grows right beside it. And it puts these little, they're called hostoria, they're little sort of parasitic roots. They perforate the thyme roots and they get inside and they suck the goodness out of the thyme roots and live on the nutrients that the thyme roots have gathered. So it's a true parasite. So the broom rape, although it's thought of as a plant, it's not really a plant because it doesn't photosynthesize at all. It just purely lives as a parasite on thyme. The other one is the Irish eyebright. You might be familiar with the eyebrights in the Burren. There's loads, it's widespread, but this one particularly is quite a rare, well, it's a very rare species actually. It's only found in the Burren. It's not found in England at all. It's just found in the Burren. And it is a semi-parasite, so it does photosynthesize and has its own leaves, but it also takes goodness out of the thyme as well. So you'll know this eyebright compared to the sort of more common one in that the leaves are much, much thinner. But keep an eye out for that one because that's very, very unusual. And of course, an orchid, I've chosen the bee orchid there. It's very distinctive. It's much smaller than maybe than we think it is when we haven't seen one because the photographs make it look as if it's huge, but it's actually quite small. And as you probably are aware, that the flower mimics a bee and a female bee, and it also gives out pheromones that attract male bees. And the male bee will come along and try to copulate and mate with the flower, thinking it's a female bee. And these two little dangly things here are called pollinia. They're little bags of pollen here. And when the bee is copulating here with the flower, those pollinia bags empty pollen on top of the bee. The bee gets very disappointed, flies off, and then the pollen will try to copulate with another flower and another plant, and the pollen will be transferred that way. Now, what you may not know is that in Ireland, it needs a very specific bee. It's the solitary longhorn bee, and that bee actually doesn't exist in Ireland. So the bee orchid in Ireland can't reproduce by using bees or invertebrates because the bee doesn't exist here. So it's learnt in Ireland to become self-pollinating in Ireland. So the bee orchids are generally self-pollinating in Ireland. Now let's move on to autumn. And we have I've chosen the Fen Violet or the Turlock Violet. Now we have lots of violets in Ireland, but this violet is very, very rare, and you can see its distribution there in the map. The first time I saw this violet, I couldn't believe my eyes because I wasn't familiar with it years ago. And I went for a walk in Cool Park, and along Cool Turlock, there were carpets of this violet. And I thought, God, what is that? I've never seen a very pale violet like that. And when I identified it, I didn't really believe it could be the rare violet because it was such in profusion. And I thought I must have got it wrong. But this violet, although very, very rare, it grows profusely, especially in Cool Park. So if you're ever over there in the autumn time, this time of year, it'd be really good to see it. you'll see it in carpets there. And the interesting fact about this is a plant that loves being trampled by cattle, and actually it benefits greatly by being trampled. And because when cattle are grazing in dried out turlocks, that's how it thrives, being trampled on. And it also thrives on water fluctuation, which is unusual because that is really hard on plants. They either, have adapted to dryness or adapted to wetness, but this plant actually needs both very wet conditions and very dry conditions to survive. So keep an eye out for that, because we are so lucky we've got such a profusion of it in the Burren, and there's very few places that it occurs like that. So the devil's bit scabious, I'm sure most of you might be familiar with this, and you probably know its connection with the marsh fritillary butterfly, because here is just the caterpillars build kind of like a nest of web over themselves for protection, and they feed on this devil's bit scabious plant. Why would I choose such a common plant here? Because yes, it's commonly distributed, but it's in profusion in the Burren as well as other places in Ireland, but particularly in the Burren, and because it's very, very important for the marsh fritillary. And I suppose it just demonstrates that plants, yes, they're lovely, and the diversity of plants is really great, and the more diversity of plants is very interesting, but they all play a vital role in the food chain. And this is a prime example of where this butterfly cannot survive without this plant. And there are a lot of plants, this is just an example, but there are a lot of plants that invertebrates and higher animals depend on them. So, nothing grows in isolation. They all have a relationship with surrounding organisms. So just to demonstrate that with this one, I suppose. And it is one that grows in the wetter, more damper parts of the Burren. And I suppose in medieval times and in traditionally, it's supposed to cure plague, worms, wind, fever, venomous bites, among many others. I've never tried it. I've never been venomously bitten. But it is reported that Satan got very jealous of all that, because he thought this plant was doing humans too good and they really should be more miserable. So he bit the tip of the taproot. You can see what a taproot looks like. It's a big, long root like a carrot. But the story goes that he bit the taproot off to stop people benefiting from it. And now it has, biologically, it has a very stubby taproot. But that's the story behind that one. And just so we finish off here in our autumn here with autumn's ladies' tresses. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen this. And if you haven't, and you have the opportunity to go out to Powell-Sala, between Powell-Sala and the Storm Beach is where I've seen it. Do go out and have a look and see if you can see it, because it's very small. It's about the height of your finger. It's blue-green. It's very much overlooked, and I think it's under recorded as well. And you really have to get down your hands and knees to have, to search properly. But if you do see it, it's such a thrill, because it's pretty rare, and because it's one of the orchids that isn't very showy. But the interesting thing about this autumn's ladies' tresses is that it can take 8 years to grow from seed to a mature plant. So it sees this here, the seed germinates underground, and that seed then grows into a kind of a rhizome, which is an underground stem. And it lives under the ground in symbiotic relationship with specialized fungi called mycorrhizae. And those mycorrhizae, those fungi that live within and around that rhizome, the orchid cannot live without it, and the mycorrhiza can't live without the orchid. They share food, and they share nutrients, etc. So they could exist together under the ground for 8 years. Then it'll start growing up, and it won't be sexually mature for another 30 or until about 13 years. So it's got a really long lifespan, which is quite amazing. And you'll know probably that most orchids need, well, all orchids need a special relationship with fungi. That's why soil health is so important for these orchids to survive. So just winter time. So winter time, it's not a great time of the year for plant growth, but a lot of activities are going on that will help and ensure the next year's flowering is going to be a good one. And I suppose that's where the the previous Burren programme comes into play now. Acres and farmers that are participating in bringing their cattle up in the winter just for the winter is so important for the Burren plants. So the cattle do an awful lot of work unbeknownst to them. They eat standing hay, which is all the grasses and plants have died back, but they're still high in nutrients because they've dried up there. So instead of gathering the hay into the barns, the hay is still standing out on the karst landscape, and the cattle can feed on those. And as they're feeding on those, they're grazing them right down to the scut, which allows all those Arctic species to survive because they need low vegetation, and they keep this from happening. They prevent the hazel scrubland encroaching and coming back. Now, I'm not saying hazel scrubland is bad, because hazel woodland is a very important ecosystem in itself, and it is totally native and natural, but it has been held back over thousands of years and allowed the Burren flora become as it is due to the farming activities. So the biodiversity has been created artificially over the centuries, over the thousands of years. But so it would be fantastic to be able to keep this into the future. The biodiversity is so important, I suppose, from not just plants, but up the food chain as well. And of course, hoof marks act as seed nurseries as well. So the seeds can be blown into those, they drop in there, and that's a perfect place for them to grow, where they've got nutrients from the cattle dung, they've got a nice hollow for protection, and the vegetation has been sort of cut back from it, I suppose. So that's there. Now, just very quickly, because I see it's getting on, but just if anybody, I'm very happy to share this with Pranjali, and she can send you on a PDF version of this if you like. But here's some identification keys, some identification online resources and map resources of distribution of plants. If anybody wants to know more about those, just sure, you can just give me a shout in the questions. But I'll leave that there. But if you are interested in any of those books or whatever, I'll give a copy to Pranjali to share. Some of the resources that I use for photos and info are there, because they're not all my photographs. And just to say, I don't have time to highlight some really other iconic species, so just leave them as photographs there. And I meant to say a special thank you to Dr. Therese Higgins as well, who lent me some of the slides that I adapted for this talk. So she's been very good to share some of her slides here. So look, thank you very much. I'll stop talking now. I hope you learned something and you enjoyed it, and that you found it entertaining in some way, manner, or form. So I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any. Cheers. Thanks.